Okay, so this is going to be a quick breakdown of this project and how I went about making these scenes. First thing first, I gathered a bunch of concept arts from Artstation just to get an idea of what I want to do. I knew that I didn't want to do a one-to-one concept, but more so just making an environment that felt epic and I could use it to make multiple type of lightings. And then for the assets, I used the Megascans library for the rocks and a bunch of cliffs and some branches. I simply imported the highest resolution into Unreal to use it, and it worked pretty well. And then for the rune pieces, I used some trim sheet textures from Simpson that you can get on his Gumroad page. He also has a YouTube video that pretty much explains you how to create a trim sheet texture, and then how to create a 3D model, and then how to properly UV unwrap it for using the trim sheet. I highly recommend it to go check it out. And then for the landscape, I bought a pack from Pixel Perfect polygons that you can find on the Unreal Marketplace, which is super nice to use because the material is pretty good. However, I did tweak heavily the shaders. Same thing for the Megascan stuff. I did tweak it in the shaders just to get what I needed. As for the fog, I simply use the vanilla height fog that comes in with Unreal 4. But I also use some blueprints, which are fog cards that you can find in the Learn section from the Epic Launcher. They have a blueprints map, which is a free demo that shows you how to use the basic blueprints. And it has a fog one, which is extremely basic, but works pretty well in my opinion. And I'm going to show you later how I use it to make something more complex than it actually is. And now I'm going to explain to you a little bit about the thought process behind this project. At first, I knew that I wanted to do an environment that I could reuse to make multiple lighting scenarios, a little bit like my relighting doodles for Ghost of the Tsushima, which you can find on my Artstation. So the thing that I had to worry about was the composition of the whole scene. I knew that the lighting couldn't be stuck with the composition, meaning that the composition would work regardless of the lighting, and then the lighting would be something on top of the composition and not so much hand in hand. That was the initial idea behind this whole project, so it would work with different lighting scenarios and not only a single one. To achieve all this composition endeavor thing in this project, I had to iterate a lot with the level art and how I dressed up the scene so the composition would work, so the eyes would flow properly throughout the image, right? I started with the rule of thirds. I knew that the gate, or at least the rune pieces, would be one of the thirds in the image, and the other one would be the cat where it would stand in the image. At some point, I kind of noticed that I followed the golden ratio, which is pretty odd, honestly. Hopefully, you can kind of see it. It starts from the top right and goes down, and then kind of ends up in the spirals down in the rune pieces. And somehow that works. I guess this would be one of the happy accident in terms of composition that I kind of stuck with. Another thing that I constantly kept in mind in terms of composition was separating my foreground from my background and middle ground. I knew that this is something important if I wanted to make the composition work regardless of the type of lighting scenarios. Managing to do that in the level art pass would be much easier for me in the end to make multiple lighting scenarios, because having a proper separation in terms of the plans, the foreground, midground, and the background is the fundamental of having a good composition, in my experience at least. One trick that I used to make the scene feel much bigger than what it actually is was tilting the room pieces a bit backward, so that would kind of sell the scale of the whole scene. Uh, I'm pretty sure God of War did that in their recent game. I believe that they tilted some of the mountain vistas, or at least something in the background, just to make it feel a lot more bigger than what it actually is. But obviously, as in terms of gameplay thing, it wouldn't work up close. So one thing that you need to understand is this project is mostly a cinematic project, meaning that this wouldn't pass at all for a gameplay environment. It is not optimized whatsoever. I'm gonna show you quickly how I tackled the fog blueprints for this project. The blueprint itself is pretty basic and it's simple. It's super simple. I didn't modify the texture at all. I just used the vanilla one that comes with it. In itself, it's only a plane that has an alpha texture. The way that I used these blueprints was kind of in the mindset of a cinematic lighting and not so much as a gameplay environment or the use of those blueprints, right? Because I basically just stack a bunch of fog blueprints on top of each other to create some depth and have a lot more nuances and have more details that kind of feels volumetric, even though it is not volumetric and it doesn't have particles. So I usually start with something that is much brighter than what I want, just to have a clear visual of what's gonna show up, because what you see is what you get. But I'm gonna start with something super bright, and then I'm gonna focus on the shape and how it's gonna feel right first, and then I'm gonna play around with the noise in itself, and that's pretty much it. I just stack a bunch of fogs on top of each other and have multiple different brightness and opacities, and I just play around with the noise size to change the shape and how it shows up. There's also the noise projection distance, which kind of helps with the variation of the noise texture in itself, even though it's the same, but it kind of distort the texture. So sometimes it kind of gives you a pretty cool effect, even though it could kind of feel broken. But it's something that it has to be used in moderation, right? You have to be very subtle about it. And as I said, I start with something way more brighter than what I want, and then I'm gonna tone it down when I have a shape and noise that I like. So I'm gonna show the lighting part of this breakdown. I'm using Unreal 4.23. There's no RTX, there's no GPU baking for the light. I'm using the most standard and vanilla version of the lighting, which is the stationary directional and stationary skylight. And then I also have a bunch of movable lights just to shape the whole environment. The way that I tackle the lighting is very cinematic. I wouldn't do this at work because it is not optimized at all. It is not game ready. You cannot ship this kind of environment. What I'm doing here, it's purely just to get a beautiful image at the end as a cinematic lighting, right? It is not game ready at all. And obviously, it wouldn't work if you were to play in this environment. If you were to look backward, it wouldn't work. If you were to look up close, it wouldn't work at all. So I'm gonna toggle on and off the lighting and the fog just to show you what it's made of. I'm gonna remove the cold fog. I'm gonna start inside the the in between the runes. I'm gonna remove the fog, which is a huge part of it. And then I have some specular lights just to make the texture pop more in terms of the roughness and specular, because it is faked. And then there's also some fill lights just to separate the shapes and the rocks inside. And something worth noticing, there's no GI inside. Most of the GI that is baked is for the middle ground, which is honestly not a lot because I ended up faking most of it. And as you can see, this is what consists of the lighting and the fog inside the runes. So I'm going to turn back on the fog, which honestly has too much fog sheets, but it's alright. And then this is all the light. And now for the middle ground, which is actually the foreground and the middle ground. There's also a lot of fog, and most of it actually lifts up all the darkest dark. It has the exponential height fog and a lot of fog sheets as well, and some gull rays as well. Now for the lights itself, there's some for the foreground just to fake the missing GI bake from the directional light. And then there's also some in the middle ground just to I'm gonna remove the fog first. There's some just to light up the stairs, and some fake GI, because again, the bake from the directional light didn't actually give me that much. I rather have in terms of cinematic lighting, at least for this project, I rather have a rather dark GI so I could control it through fake lighting, rather than having a more than enough GI and then having a hard time removing it, right? Because there's no negative lighting in Unreal, as far as I know. And so this is mostly why it's pretty dark without the fog and the GI. Again, this is probably not the best way or the right way to tackle this, but this is purely because it's a personal project. And then there's also some light that I shot from the side, just to make the specular pop up a little bit more on the runes here. And now with the fog back on, as you can see, there's a lot of movable lights, and yeah, it is not optimized at all. Now for the composition part of this breakdown, I'm gonna try to explain a little bit what I've been thinking when I made this whole project. As I said, I kind of accidentally had the golden ratio, which I'm not sure if it's the best, but it kind of works, and that's what I think, at least. So you kind of start from the top right, and it flows down here. It goes back up with the tree on the left, and with the formation of the rune and how it stumbles down, it kind of goes back here with the stairs, and then how the rocks underneath this pillar, it's kind of holding it, kind of forms back another spiral, and that's how it ends for the golden ratio. And it may be scuffed, but it kind of works, I believe, in my opinion at least. And then for the foreground, because I did mention that I wanted to separate the plans, the foreground from the middle ground to the background. So as you can see, there's the darkest plan of the environment, which is the foreground, which is all of this, right? And then there's the middle ground, which is mostly lit from the sun in the middle, and it has the most attention on the cat, which is in the middle ground, which is also in the on the rule of thirds. And finally, there's the background, which is obviously a lot colder in terms of colors to contrast with the warmer, more middle ground and foreground, right? Which is this is considered my background. And in terms of shapes as well, notice that most of the foreground and the middle ground is mostly rocks, mostly organic shapes. There's it's rocks and it's fog and there's trees and stuff. But in the background, which is made of more straight shapes, which are the runes, and how it's man-made, not as much as organic. So that's the contrast part of the shape. And then there's also another thing that I did, which was to repeat some objects from the foreground and the middle ground and background, just to sell the scale of the grandeur of the whole scene, right? You can see there's a few pieces of tree on both sides, but notice that there's also the same tree a bit further in the middle ground. So hopefully that kind of helps you figure it out, the scale of the whole place, of how big it is. Same thing with the rune pieces on the right. It's the same pieces that you can find here. So the point was to repeat some objects that is a bit scattered throughout the whole scene in the foreground, middle ground, and background.